Hello and welcome to the Garden Log. I thought I would just reintroduce myself, or maybe introduce myself for the benefit of new people joining in 2022. I am Ben Dark and I am principally a gardener, but I'm also a garden thinker, not a philosopher or anyone with particular profundity, but someone who spends a lot of time thinking about gardens. And the Garden Log is an outlet for those thoughts, as well as a place to report on the practical aspects of my garden life. It is now the second week of January 2022. I went back to the UK for a little in December. I actually went back on two separate trips. First time was to graduate as a Master of Garden History. Finally, those of you who have been listening to the podcast will know that I've been studying that course almost as long as I've been talking to you. I finally finished and I managed to pass with a distinction, which I'm telling you because I won't be able to tell anyone else because no one ever asks, oh, what did you get in your masters? But the audience here will know. And while there, I managed to go and see a little bit of London. They were strange times over there in London. Some things were closing down, while others were having a sort of bacchanalian last hurrah. Pubs full of office workers in little paper hats, while grim-faced newsreaders read out statistics of infection numbers. I exposed myself... Sorry, I was going to say, just thinking ahead in my sentence there, I was going to say, I exposed myself in some of the pubs. I exposed myself to some risk in some of the pubs, but spent most of the time keeping out of harm's way. I visited Regent's Park to go and look at the bedding displays there. Professional gardeners get very upset when people start talking about putting the garden to bed and saying, well, that'll be the last session for the year and now it's time to let it all rest. But I think in the domestic garden, there is some validity to that. I think it's quite nice not to have to harry oneself out of the door and say, right, what's on the list today? Got to put my 5 hours gardening in. One of the things that probably drew most of us northern or southern hemisphere gardeners, as opposed to equatorial gardeners, into this whole business was seeing the change over the year, the excitement as the garden inhales and exhales and occasionally passes out for a few months. And I think that that's something to be celebrated, a time where we can reflect, look out of the window. But not all gardens do go to bed. There are some gardens that must retain a crowd-pleasing vivacity and brightness all year round. And these are the great bedding gardens, the few which still survive from their heyday in the Victorian period. And Regent's Park has one such. So I went along there to see what the people who are still engaged in gardening were doing. And a great job they were doing too. The Regent's Park staff, the Royal Parks people, had Dutch trolleys everywhere. Dutch trolleys are what plants arrive on when you order them in bulk from the continent. They're great wheeled cabinets with open shelves. It's always very exciting when you see one because you know someone's gone and spent some money and things are going to go into the ground. And they were unloading the last of their evergreen grasses, their carexes and whatever else. It was quite interesting. The colour that unified the gardens was a colour that's actually probably quite divisive. It was a sort of undersea green, the sort of grass green that you get when you've left something on the lawn too long. A sort of paddling pool-shaped ring of grass on its way to being albino, where the plants have decided, well, I'm not getting any light up here, so I might as well take all these nutrients and expensive chlorophyll-producing compounds back down into my roots and look after them until they'll be appreciated again. And that was the dominant colour, that off-green, in various carexes and things that had hanging down from the big planters and by the big lions. I quite liked it, but I think that's because over years in horticulture, my taste is just getting worse and worse. I'm growing more soft-hearted rather than ruthless. I think when I started and I knew nothing, I was incredibly cutting and precise with my criticisms of plants. And then you spend years with them, and you start to feel affection for the weirdest, most rubbishy colours and schemes. I have a growing affection for straggly bits of unlovable shrubbery and grasses that are splattered on the bed like someone was clearing seaweed from the paths. And so I was quite charmed by them all. I didn't like the black phormium next to that off-green carex. I thought that was a little bit of a step too far. I even enjoyed the little Euonymus fortunei hedges. And these weren't hedges in that fairly classy, variegated emerald gaiety type. These were variegated in the emerald and gold type. But it was a day of grey skies, and I hadn't seen good winter bedding for a while, and I was quite overwhelmed with the cheerfulness of it all. I realised that here, where people are passing through and looking for a bit of cheer wherever they can find it, we just need colour and the sense that your authorities, be they the park keepers, the royal park keepers, or local authorities, or anyone, a sense that they care enough to give something to your eyes, even if it's an illusion. And those hedges did a very good, effective job at that. The other star of the trip was the Mahonia, which was out in full blast, something Victorian in character, but rather Jurassic or Triassic perhaps in look. It's another plant that I think we've become over familiar with, but actually when you return to look at a good Mahonia cross media, which is the one we most commonly see planted, the volume of flowers is fantastic. It would not look out of place in the height of summer, growing from something much more herbaceous. It was altogether a heartening trip, and it sent me back to Denmark, feeling proud of the gardeners, of what I still think of as my home city. The second trip back, we managed to get in on Christmas Eve and out on New Year's Eve. And I did a little bit of gardening, moving a vast pile of grass clippings out of the way of next year's grass clippings. It's the sort of mindless post-Christmas work that you really want. Go outside with a cup of tea and a pitchfork and spend 25 minutes pretending that all the damage done to one's body in the feasting and drinking of the previous 5 days has been undone with just a few lobbings. Each time I chucked a spadeful, I made sure to do a good worker's grunt and felt very virtuous at the end of it. It was quite exciting as well because it's such a loose material that you get to see the rootscape, the roots of the plants under the soil, which we don't see even when one's digging out, say, a massive clump of nettles, of which there were a lot in this pile. They cling and are so tightly compressed by the soil that the spade and the fork just snap them. But under rotting grass material, you can expose a whole plain of them. They look like a river network seen from above. And nettles in particular have a glorious pink tinge to their tip, their thick white things shading into this lovely red, which is probably some anthocyanin or something, pumped in there to protect those little tender underground roots. Unfortunately, they did not work against me and my cup of tea, and they were hoyed away as well. The other plant growing all through the heap was Arum italicum, that very ornamental relative of our native cuckoo pint, with the brilliantly mottled leaves, the dark scales, and the lighter bit in between. They have the texture if you poured a cup of watered down PVA glue onto a big saltwater crocodile's back and watched all the watered glue flow in between those plates and scales of dark armour. And these were growing wonderfully through the heap, and I realised how quickly they can move. The runners they put out, they can go 2 foot in a growth season, one single runner. And I always thought of this plant as incredibly slow-moving, something that worked its way up to a decent set of leaves and a few respectable spathes. Respectable, it's not a respectable plant at all. They're not respectable spathes of berries. A few almost obscene spathes of berries, but still did so slowly. And I realised that's only because I tend to plant it or see it or tolerate it only in places of extreme shade. When it is in a soft soil with sunlight coming down on it, it really does have some legs on it. So well done, Arum italicum. A plant more vigorous than I knew. And that was it. The end of my gardening for 2021. We came back to Denmark in time for the barrage of New Year's Eve fireworks. And I began my 2022 homework of inveigling my way into the gardening community here. Nothing's quite come of it yet, but there are some Arum italicum style rhizomes spreading out beneath the social fabric of this country, and hopefully some of them will find a good place and sprout up and let me drop this analogy. Back here, my biggest gardening task has been in the front garden, and that has been removing a skirt of Aucuba japonica from the thick trunk of this old cotinus cogigrea, and that is the smoke bush. You probably come across it. This is a very common type of smoke bush. We've got one of the very dark purple-leaved ones, and the Aucuba japonica had got itself into a position where it completely hid the legs of this tree, and so it almost seemed like something built from Lego or Duplo, like a big square blob of Aucuba with a big dome of purple on the top. 2 blocks, 2 different colours, 2 plants, 2 different colours, all very geometric. And actually underneath the Aucuba, the cotinus had grown quite an interesting textured fissured bark. They do that after a while. They start very, very smooth, lovely smooth branches, but eventually they will put some crag on. It takes about 15 years to get a really good crag. And this one has a good split into 2 main leaders at about 4 foot in the air, and is really quite attractive. So I cut the Aucuba away. I didn't remove it completely. I let it stay. Again, it's another part of age-induced sentimentality. Aucuba japonica was one of the definite plants you were allowed to hate when we were at horticultural college, when you couldn't have any opinion about anything because really, what did we know? We knew we hated Aucuba japonica. But actually, it's quite good. It's quite cheerful. It's got more of that strange off-green colour, and even the variegation. I mean, I know that it depends on the cultivar. Even the variegation on this one wasn't as offensive as I thought. It's a good healthy plant. It doesn't have any of the dieback that is associated with this plant. There's a common thing that most gardeners would have encountered, where you say, well, at least I don't have to worry about the Aucuba. Imagine it must be like being a parent of a large brood and knowing for sure, well, I don't have to worry about James because he's the sensible one and he's put his savings in an ISA. The other ones, they're out of control. I can't think what they're going to do next. And then one day you come home and James has got his face tattooed and you think, but James, you're the one I didn't have to worry about. And you feel that way about Aucuba, you know, at least that will stay alive and always be green. And then you come along and it's got a big dead branch wilting and hanging, flopping black leaves from it. It's a common thing. I thought that when I started noticing it, I thought that maybe I was the first to see a new notifiable disease sweeping the UK, and that we would lose all Aucubas, that they would go the way of the ash and slowly succumb to this wilt. but it seems to be a pretty consistent part of the plant's growing style. There's a Japanese garden manual from the very early 18th century, from 1710 or 12 or something, that talks about how, yes, it's a nice enough plant, but occasionally the leaves become desiccated and it looks like the thing's been burned. And that's what they do. That's what they do to us here as well. I think it's a waterlogging issue in the roots. Luckily, the soil here in Copenhagen is sandy enough that I think our one will stay strong. It's actually another fortune plant, like Euonymus fortunei, that I was talking about in Regent's Park. Well, it's a sort of half fortune plant, because I think it came over well before him. It came over in the later part of the 18th century, in the 1780s or 90s, and did that very Georgian plant dance that they did in that period, moving from the stove house to the greenhouse to the grounds, and always, when's it going to die? When's it going to die? When's it going to die? Oh no, it will never die. It's fully hardy. The same thing that camellias did. And so it got out into the gardens in the 19th century, and then became a superstar, an absolute hero of a plant in all of the London parks, particularly. Regent's Park, I'm sure, were they there exactly 200 years earlier, would have been crammed full of the thing. It's so strange. We think of it now with those lovely cherry-like, well, not quite cherry-like, but more like a cross between a cherry and a rosehip berries. But there were none until 1865, when Robert Fortune bought back a male plant. And all of the plants grown prior to that had been female. They'd all been clones of these original introductions. And finally, there is this lucky male whose pollen now gets to meet these females growing on their own for 85 years. And then you've got berries for the first time. I can't imagine having a plant in your garden for so many years and then suddenly realizing there is another aspect to it. There is a winter interest here. Anyway, I cut a lot of that back and left some of the other stuff to be a bit of a green in winter in the deep shade there. It's a plant that I recommend the non-variegated cultivars. My taste hasn't slid that far yet. Listen to this podcast again in a couple of years and I'll say go as spotty as you like. But for now, I think something like a Rosanni, that unvariegated pure green form, or the type longifolia, the salicifolia version of the longifolia, that's obviously willow-leaved from Salix. That's another good one, which is a little bit more classy and less likely to have first-year horticulture students sniffing at your lovely garden. Other than that, my main job has been edging the lawn. I've been putting a razor blade fine cut 90-degree angles as made in a German laboratory on the whole thing, which sounds rather obsessive and clean-minded, but it's purely so that the rest of the garden can flourish in its state of wild abandon, in its state of leering, looming arches of rose growth, and all the fluff from the Japanese anemones still there and blustering across the garden. It's strange how things can be affected by the lawn. It's like a shave can make your shoes look better. And you think, but there's a whole body in between them. There's this awful pair of trousers I'm wearing. How on earth can my bristled or non-bristled chin have an effect? But it does, because we see gardens and people as a whole. And I think that by putting this crisp, clean definition on the edge of my grass areas, it makes all of my other laziness and seasonal withdrawal from the garden look intentional. It looks as if there is a plan behind the wildness. So that has been a useful and actually much commented upon job. And that's it. Practically speaking, that's my gardening for the last month. What a joy to be inside looking at the garden from the window. seeing all of the little birds, the little tits and chaffinches that I'm feeding on the feeders at the front, and the roving magpies at the back, and wondering how many nests have I facilitated with my calories, how many extra eggs are there going to be because of me, and how many of those are those dastardly magpies going to get. It really is an entire ecosystem fueled by my tube of peanuts. But enough of tubes of peanuts, or tubes of any sort. Let's see if I have any recommendations for us this week. This week I have been reading my Proust, as any good gardener should be doing in the off-season, and I was just remembering how good a writer he is about gardening. It's not a surprise that he writes well about gardening, because writing well about gardening is about the right observation, and he is the master observer of all things. Of course, the garden observations come with a lot attached to them, but we can enjoy those attachments while waiting for the next description of irises, no matter if they're in 4 books' time and 5,000 pages. I wanted to share 2 little bits which I just think are magnificent, both in different ways. One of them for its succinctness, and one of them for its full Proustian elaboration on a theme. The first is a description of his grandmother, who has been sent out by the great aunt. Proust, by the way, is a brilliant aunt crafter, a far better crafter of aunts than P.G. Wodehouse or Saki or those other more famous creator of comical relatives. Anyway, the grandmother's been sent out to wait for Swan. And then my grandmother would be sent out as a scout, always happy to find an excuse for an additional turn in the garden, which she would utilize to remove, surreptitiously as she passed, the stakes of a rose tree or 2, so as to make the roses look a little more natural, as a mother might run her hand through her boy's hair after the bather has smoothed it down, to make it stick out properly around his head. And I thought that was wonderful. Firstly, because it's the right way to treat your roses, but secondly, as a way to give a brief introduction to a character who is probably one of the few wholly good, less complicated characters in the book. That they feel this way about gardens, the way that a mother might feel about her boy. No one who does that, and for those reasons, can be a bad person. The second is on to more important matters, and the asparagus. And this is more typical of Proust's writing about plants. We begin on peas. I would stop by the table where the kitchen maid had shelled them to inspect the platoons of peas, drawn up in ranks and numbered like little green marbles, ready for a game. But what fascinated me would be the asparagus, tinged with ultramarine and rosy pink, which ran from their heads, finely stippled in mauve and azure, through a series of imperceptible changes to their white feet, still stained a little by the soil of their garden bed. A rainbow loveliness that was not of this world. I felt that these celestial hues indicated the presence of exquisite creatures who had been pleased to assume vegetable form, who, through the disguise which covered their firm and edible flesh, allowed me to discern in this radiance of earliest dawn, these hinted rainbows, these blue evening shades, that precious quality, which I should recognize again, when, all night long, after a dinner at which I had partaken of them, they played, lyrical and coarse in their jesting as the fairies of Shakespeare's dream, at transforming my humble chamber into a bower of aromatic perfume. What a way to describe asparagus and the famous effect it has on one's pea. Shakespeare and his dream and all the celestial tones and pinks. And so if you do have any time this winter, I'd recommend dipping in a little bit and seeing how someone else looks at the world. There's no greater opportunity to see the world through someone else's eyes, really see it, than reading that In Remembrance of Time Past series. It's almost what fiction should be for, and it's got quite a lot of good plant stuff in it too. So have a look at that. And otherwise, I shall sign off, a slightly shorter episode than normal, and hopefully talk to you all again in a week or a fortnight or so, when I have begun the campaign for 2022's gardens. I've got a vast amount of fairly interesting looking seed packets lined up and ready to go. So I'm going to be rigging up some sort of propagation area and getting them going and giving exhaustive Proustian updates on the sentiments invoked by the curling of the little cotyledon petals, sending me back to a student party where someone did something disgraceful or other such reminiscences. Anyway, you'll have to wait for that until they start germinating. Until then, I hope you have a wonderful time, whether you get out into the garden or not. Whether you get out into your own garden, go to someone else's garden, look at what they've been doing. Sometimes it's almost more interesting. But anyway, I hope that I might hear from some of you. If you want to contact me, you can email me at thegardenlogpodcast@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram at ben_dark_again, or on Twitter at Ben's Garden. Come and say hello and ask me any questions you might have about your own gardens, your own life. I can give advice on all sorts of areas. So, until next time, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.